3 months later, Sarah sat in her new office at Riley Construction, looking out the window at a view that still seemed surreal. The job Margaret's brother had offered turned out to be managing the company's accounts and scheduling, work that challenged her mind in ways waitressing never had. The pay was nearly double what she'd made at the diner, and for the first time in years she wasn't counting pennies to make ends meet. Emma had joined the school's advanced math program, something they never could have afforded before with the additional tutoring costs. Tony was taking piano lessons and had discovered he had a natural talent for music. Both children seemed lighter somehow, as if they could sense that the constant worry that had shadowed their mother for so long had finally lifted. The scholarship fund the bikers had established had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Word of Sarah's story had spread through social media and news coverage, inspiring donations from strangers across the country. Financial advisors had been brought in to manage the money, ensuring that both Emma and Tony would not only have their college educations fully paid for, but would have funds left over to help them start their adult lives. Sarah kept in touch with many of the bikers who had visited that day. Margaret had become a close friend, calling every few weeks to check in and share stories about her grandchildren. Big Jim sent postcards from motorcycle rallies across the country, always signed, "Your Iron Eagles family." Marcus visited whenever his construction crew had work in the area, usually bringing small gifts for the children and updates about how Sarah's story continued to inspire others in the riding community. The legal aftermath had been swift and decisive. Officer Bradley had been fired from the police department and faced criminal charges for filing false reports and harassment. The department had implemented new training programs on bias and proper procedure, using Sarah's case as an example of how citizen advocacy could help root out corruption. Captain Rodriguez had personally visited Sarah to thank her again, and to let her know that several other officers had come forward with their own concerns about Bradley's behavior. But perhaps the most unexpected consequence of that day was how Sarah's own confidence had transformed. The woman who had once apologized for taking up space now spoke up in meetings at work, volunteered for Emma's school committee, and had even started dating again after meeting a kind teacher at Tony's school. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Sarah was helping Tony with a particularly challenging piano piece when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something prompted her to answer. "Sarah? This is Maria Santos. I'm calling from Phoenix, Arizona." "Hello, Maria, how can I help you?" "Well, this might sound strange, but I heard about what you did for that biker a few months ago. I'm in a similar situation, and I was hoping you might have some advice." Sarah sat down, giving Maria her full attention. Over the next 20 minutes, she learned that Maria was a single mother working at a grocery store who had witnessed her manager stealing from the register. Like Sarah had been, Maria was terrified of losing her job if she reported the theft, but she also couldn't stand by and watch it continue. "I keep thinking about your story," Maria said. "How you stood up for what was right even when it was scary. I just don't know if I'm brave enough." Sarah found herself smiling, remembering her own fear on that day that had changed everything. "Maria, I wasn't brave either. I was terrified. But sometimes doing the right thing isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what you know is right even when you are afraid." They talked for another hour, with Sarah sharing not just encouragement but practical advice about documenting evidence and reporting procedures. When Maria finally hung up, promising to take action, Sarah realized that her story had become more than just a personal triumph. It had become a beacon for others facing their own moments of truth. That evening, as Sarah tucked Tony into bed, he looked up at her with his father's dark eyes and asked, "Mommy, why did all those people come to see you at the diner?" Sarah had been dreading this question, unsure how to explain complex issues of justice and courage to a 6-year-old. But looking at her son's earnest face, the answer came naturally. "Sometimes, sweetheart, people need help, and other people pretend not to see it because helping might be hard or scary. But when someone does help, it reminds everyone else that we're supposed to take care of each other." Tony nodded solemnly, processing this information with the seriousness children bring to important concepts. "So you helped the nice man with the motorcycle?" "I did. And then his friends wanted to say thank you?" "That's right. Tony smiled, satisfied with this explanation. I think that's nice. I want to help people too when I grow up. Later that night, after both children were asleep, Sarah sat on her small balcony with a cup of tea, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. The scared, struggling woman who had walked into the Blue Moon diner that morning seemed like a different person now. Not because her circumstances had changed, though they certainly had, but because she had discovered something about herself that had been there all along. The courage to stand up for others hadn't been something she'd developed overnight. It had been built through years of small acts of strength, getting up every morning to provide for her children, working extra shifts when money was tight, maintaining hope when everything seemed impossible. The moment with Marcus had simply been the first time circumstances had called upon her to use that strength for someone else. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. Saw the news story about the woman in Phoenix who reported her boss for stealing. She mentioned your story as her inspiration. Thought you'd want to know you're still changing lives. Sarah smiled, understanding now that the ripples from that afternoon at the diner would continue spreading in ways she might never fully know. Every person who found the courage to speak up, every act of kindness between strangers, every moment when someone chose to see past appearances to the person beneath, all of it was connected. The next morning, Sarah woke up to find Emma all ready, dressed and making breakfast for Tony, a responsibility she'd taken on as her contribution to their smoother mornings. The sight of her daughter carefully measuring cereal and milk filled Sarah with pride and gratitude. Good morning, Mom, Emma said, looking up from her task. Mrs. Rodriguez from the school called. She wants to know if you'll speak to the high school students about citizenship and standing up for what's right. Sarah considered the request. A year ago, the idea of speaking in front of teenagers would have terrified her. Now it felt like an opportunity to pay forward the blessings that had come from one moment of courage. Tell her yes, Sarah said, ruffling Tony's hair as he giggled over his breakfast. Tell her I'd be honored. As her children finished eating and gathered their school supplies, Sarah realized that the most important lesson from her experience wasn't about confronting corrupt police officers or standing up to bullies. It was about recognizing that ordinary people in ordinary moments have extraordinary power to change the world, one act of courage at a time. The woman who had once felt invisible and powerless now knew better. She had always been strong, enough to make a difference. She had just needed the right moment to prove it to herself. The lunch rush turned into something Sarah had never experienced before. Customers kept arriving throughout the day, not just bikers, but regular folks who had heard about what happened and wanted to show their support. The local news station showed up around 2 o'clock, followed by reporters from 2 neighboring towns. Sarah found herself thrust into an unfamiliar spotlight as cameras rolled and questions flew. What made you decide to intervene when the police were questioning Marcus? Riley? Asked a young reporter with perfectly styled hair. I saw someone being treated unfairly and I couldn't stay quiet, Sarah answered simply, wiping nervous sweat from her palms on her apron. It didn't matter what he looked like or how he dressed. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. The questions continued, but Sarah kept her answers focused on the principle rather than the drama. She didn't want to come across as someone seeking attention or trying to become famous from the incident. She was just a working mother who had done what felt right in the moment. Marcus stood nearby during the interviews, and she could see the pride in his eyes. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, he approached her with something she hadn't expected to see: tears in his tough old eyes. Sarah, I need you to know something, he said quietly. I've been writing for over 30 years, and I've faced prejudice and harassment more times than I can count. Usually people just look the other way, grateful it's not happening to them. Yesterday you stood up when it would have been so much easier to stay silent. He paused, collecting himself before continuing. My daughter died 3 years ago in a car accident. She was a teacher, and she always told her students to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Watching you yesterday, I saw her spirit, alive in someone else. That's a gift I never expected to receive. Sarah felt her own eyes well up with tears. The weight of responsibility she'd been carrying seemed lighter somehow. Knowing that her actions had honored the memory of someone she'd never met, but who had clearly been special. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd began to thin, but the impact of the day was impossible to ignore. Frank had sold more food than any single day in the diner's history. The tip jar behind the counter was overflowing, and several customers had specifically asked that their tips go directly to Sarah. Big Jim approached the counter as the day was winding down, holding an envelope in his massive hands. "Sarah, the Iron Eagles took up a collection. We know what it's like to struggle, and we know what it costs to stand up for what's right." Sarah opened the envelope and gasped. There had to be over $2,000 inside, more money than she'd ever seen, at one time in her entire life. "I can't accept this," she said, trying to hand the envelope back. "It's too much." "Yes, you can, and yes, you will," Margaret said firmly, appearing beside Big Jim. "This isn't charity, honey. This is gratitude from people who understand the value of courage." An older woman with a gray braid and gentle eyes spoke up from a nearby booth. "Dear, I'm a retired teacher, and I've seen what happens when good people stay silent. Your children are lucky to have a mother who shows them what standing up for others looks like." The mention of her children brought a fresh wave of emotion. Emma and Tony would never know how close they'd come to losing their home, their security, their stability. But now, for the first time in years, Sarah felt like she could breathe without worrying about the next crisis. As the sun began to set, the last of the bikers prepared to leave. They had rally events to attend, jobs to return, to families waiting at home. But before they left, something unexpected happened. Marcus stood up and called for everyone's attention. "Friends, we came here today to honor someone who showed real courage, but I think we need to do more than just shake hands and ride away." He turned to Sarah. "We've been talking, and we want to do something for you and your children. The riding community is like a big extended family, and you're part of that family now." Big Jim stepped forward again, this time with a different kind of envelope. "Sarah, we've set up a scholarship fund for your kids. Every chapter that heard about what you did is contributed. Emma and Tony will have their college educations paid for, no matter what happens." Sarah's knees nearly buckled. A college education for her children had been a distant dream, something she hoped for but never dared to count on. The financial pressure of raising 2 kids alone had made saving for college seem impossible. "There's more," Margaret added with a smile. "My brother owns a construction company in the next town over. He's always looking for good people in his office, and the pay is better than waitressing. If you're interested, the job is yours." Sarah looked around at all these faces that had seemed so intimidating when she'd first walked into work that morning. Now she saw them clearly. Hard-working people who understood struggle, who valued loyalty and courage, who took care of their own. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you doing all this for me?" Marcus smiled, the same gentle expression she'd seen when he first walked into the diner. "Because yesterday, when it mattered, you saw past the leather and the tattoos and the stereotypes. You saw a person who deserved to be treated fairly. That's becoming rarer in this world, and it deserves to be rewarded." As the bikers began filing out, each one stopped to shake Sarah's hand or give her a hug. Phone numbers were exchanged. Promises were made to stay in touch. The Iron Eagles presented her with an honorary membership patch and told her she'd always have family wherever their chapters rode. Frank watched the exodus with amazement. 30 years I've been running this place," he said to Sarah, "and I've never seen anything like today. You've got something special, Sarah. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise." As the last motorcycle rumbled out of the parking lot, Sarah stood in the doorway of the diner, still trying to process everything that had happened. 24 hours ago, she'd been a struggling single mother worried about making rent. Now she had enough money to secure her family's future, a better job opportunity, and the knowledge that she'd gained respect from people who understood what real strength looked like. The evening shift waitress, Jennifer, arrived as Sarah was, cleaning up. "Holy cow, what happened here? It looks like a tornado hit the place, but Frank's walking around like he won the lottery." Sarah laughed, realizing she felt lighter than she had in years. That evening, Sarah drove home with her mind spinning like a washing machine on the fritz. She'd called her babysitter, Mrs. Chen, to say she'd be late, but she hadn't mentioned why. How do you explain to your elderly neighbor that you just stood up to corrupt police officers and might have put your family at risk? Her small apartment felt both like a sanctuary and a trap when she finally walked through the door. Emma was doing homework at the kitchen table, her tongue poking out in concentration, as she worked on math problems. Tony was building an elaborate castle with his blocks, making quiet explosion sounds as imaginary battles played out in his head. "Mommy!" Tony launched himself at her legs, nearly knocking her over with the force of his enthusiasm. "Mrs. Chen made us grilled cheese and we watched cartoons and I built the biggest castle ever." Sarah scooped him up, breathing in his little boy scent of soap and playground dirt. These moments reminded her why everything she did mattered. Her children needed stability, safety, and a mother who could provide for them. Had she jeopardized all of that for a stranger? "How was work, Mom?" Emma asked without looking up from her homework. At 8 years old, she was already showing signs of the responsibility that came with being the older sibling in a single-parent household. "It was eventful," Sarah said carefully, settling Tony on the couch with his blocks. "Did you two eat dinner already?" "Mrs. Chen fed us," Emma replied. "But she said you sounded stressed on the phone. Is everything okay?" Sarah's heart ached at how perceptive her daughter was. Children in single-parent homes often developed an extra sensitivity to their parents' moods, always watching for signs that their already precarious world might shift again. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Just a busy day at work." But as she helped Emma finish her homework and got both children ready for bed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something much bigger than she'd realized. Marcus had seemed genuinely grateful, but would that translate into anything meaningful? More importantly, would there be consequences she hadn't considered? The next morning dawned gray and drizzling, matching Sarah's mood perfectly. She'd barely slept, alternating between worry about potential retaliation and replaying the events at the diner. Every scenario her tired mind conjured seemed to end with her losing her job, her apartment, her ability to provide for Emma and Tony. The drive to work felt longer than usual. When the Blue Moon Diner came into view, Sarah's heart nearly stopped. The parking lot was completely full and there were more vehicles than she'd ever seen in one place. Motorcycles. Dozens and dozens of motorcycles, lined up in neat rows like chrome and steel soldiers at attention. Sarah parked her battered Honda Civic at the far edge of the lot, her hands shaking as she turned off the engine. Through the diner's windows, she could see figures in leather jackets filling every booth and chair. Her first instinct was to drive away, to call in sick, to avoid whatever confrontation was waiting inside. But she needed this job. Emma had a field trip next week that required a $20 permission slip, and Tony needed new shoes. Running away wasn't an option when you had children counting on you. The door chime seemed extra loud as she pushed inside, and the conversation that had been filling the diner suddenly stopped. Every face turned toward her. Leather-clad men and women with tattoos, gray beards, and eyes that had seen too much of the world's rough edges. Sarah felt like a rabbit that had stumbled into a wolf pack meeting. Then Marcus stood up from a corner booth, and the tension in Sarah's shoulders eased slightly. "Everyone," he said in a voice that carried easily through the sudden silence, "I'd like you to meet Sarah Martinez, the woman I told you about." What happened next would stay with Sarah for the rest of her life. Every single person in that diner, and there had to be at least 50 of them, stood up and began to applaud. Not polite, brief clapping, but sustained, heartfelt applause that seemed to go on forever. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes as she looked around at these intimidating strangers who were showing her more respect than she'd received in years. A woman with silver hair and kind eyes approached her first. "Honey, I'm Margaret, Marcus's sister," she said, pulling Sarah into a warm hug. "Thank you for standing up for my brother. It takes real courage to do what you did." "I just did what anyone should do," Sarah said, echoing her words from the day before. "No, darling," said a gruff voice behind Margaret. Sarah turned to see a mountain of a man with a gray beard that reached his chest. "What you did was special. I'm Big Jim, president of the Iron Eagles chapter. We've been riding all night to get here." "All night?" Sarah looked around the crowded diner with new understanding. You came here because of what happened yesterday? Marcus nodded, his eyes soft with emotion. Sarah, when word got out about how you defended me, a complete stranger, against corrupt cops who were abusing their power, it spread through the writing community like wildfire. These people came from 3 states away to meet the woman with enough backbone to stand up for what's right. An older man with a Vietnam veteran's patch on his jacket stepped forward. Ma'am, I served in Vietnam and came home to people spitting on me and calling me a baby killer. I've spent 50 years watching good people stay silent while others get treated unfairly because of how they look or where they come from. What you did yesterday reminded me that there are still people willing to fight the good fight. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the emotion in the room. These weren't the dangerous criminals that Officer Bradley had painted them as. They were veterans, construction workers, teachers, even a few small business owners. They were people who understood what it meant to be judged by their appearance rather than their actions. Frank's going to flip when he sees this crowd, Sarah said, thinking of her boss who typically served maybe 20 customers on a busy morning. Margaret laughed, a sound like silver bells. Oh, honey, we already talked to Frank. He's in the kitchen, right now, cooking as fast as he can and grinning like he won the lottery. This is probably the biggest day in this diner's history. As if summoned by her words, Frank pushed through the kitchen doors carrying plates loaded with eggs, bacon, and hash browns. His usually worried expression had been replaced by pure joy. Sarah, thank God you're here. I've never seen anything like this in 30 years of running this place. They've been telling me what happened yesterday and I couldn't be prouder of you. Throughout the morning, Sarah served coffee, took orders, and listened to stories. She learned that Marcus had called his writing buddies not to brag about being defended, but to tell them about the single mother who'd risked everything to stand up for a stranger. Word had spread through social media, phone calls, and the tight-knit networks that connected motorcycle communities across the country. Every single person who'd made the journey to the diner left a substantial tip, not just $1 or $2, but 10s and 20s, sometimes more. By noon, Sarah had earned more in tips than she usually made in 2 weeks. The next 20 minutes felt like hours as they waited for the police supervisor to arrive. Officer Bradley paced near the door like a caged animal, shooting venomous looks at both Sarah and Marcus. The tension was so thick that other potential customers took one look through the window and kept driving. Sarah tried to keep busy, wiping down tables and refilling condiment bottles, but her hands wouldn't stop trembling. She kept thinking about her children. Emma, age 8, and Little. Tony, just 6. What if Bradley decided to retaliate? What if she lost her job? The questions swirled in her mind like a tornado, but every time she looked at Marcus sitting calmly at the counter, she knew she'd made the right choice. Marcus hadn't moved from his stool except to put a $20 bill on the counter for his coffee and pie, far more than the actual cost. For the trouble, he'd said quietly when Sarah protested the amount. When the supervisor finally arrived, Sarah felt a wave of relief. Captain Rodriguez was a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and an air of quiet authority. She took one look at the scene. Bradley's aggressive posture, the nervous younger officers, Marcus sitting peacefully and Sarah behind the counter, and immediately understood that something was wrong. All right, everyone take a breath, Captain Rodriguez said as she entered. Officer Patterson, give me a situation report. Patterson, the older officer, cleared his throat. Ma'am, we received a report of suspicious activity in the neighborhood. When we arrived to investigate, we found this individual. He gestured toward Marcus. Having coffee. Sergeant Bradley believed he matched the description of the suspect. And what description was that? The captain asked. Bradley stepped forward, his jaw tight. Male, riding a motorcycle, wearing leather, classic biker gang profile. Captain Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. Officer Bradley, that description could fit thousands of people. Did we have any specific identifying features? Age? Height? Distinctive markings? The silence that followed was telling. Bradley's face reddened as he realized how thin his justification sounded when examined by someone who actually cared about proper procedure. Captain, Sarah spoke up, her voice stronger now. "This gentleman has been nothing but polite and respectful." He showed his identification, including military service records. Officer Bradley refused to look at them properly and made inappropriate accusations about both of us. Captain Rodriguez turned to Marcus. "Sir, may I see your identification?" Marcus handed over his documents without hesitation. The captain examined them carefully, taking her time to read everything thoroughly. Her expression softened when she saw his military service record. "Army Rangers, 2 tours in Afghanistan," she said respectfully. "Thank you for your service, sir." "It was an honor, ma'am," Marcus replied simply. Captain Rodriguez turned back to Bradley. "Officer, I need you to explain to me how a decorated veteran having coffee constitutes suspicious activity worthy of arrest." Bradley's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The complainant said, "What complainant?" the captain interrupted. "I've checked with dispatch. There was no call about suspicious activity in this area today." The words hit like a bombshell. Sarah felt her knees go weak as the implications sank in. Bradley had lied about receiving a complaint. He'd targeted Marcus purely based on his appearance and preconceptions. "Furthermore," Captain Rodriguez continued, her voice taking on an icy edge, "I've reviewed the 911 call that was placed from this establishment. The dispatcher recorded allegations of harassment and misconduct. This is now an internal affairs matter." Bradley's face went white. Internal affairs investigations could end careers, and everyone in the diner knew it. The rookie officer, looking relieved that the truth was finally coming out, spoke up. "Captain, the sergeant told us we were responding to a complaint, but when we got here..." He immediately focused on the gentleman at the counter. The waitress tried to explain that he'd been here for over an hour, but Sergeant Bradley wouldn't listen. "Is that accurate, Officer Patterson?" the captain asked. Patterson nodded reluctantly. "Yes, ma'am. The situation escalated when the civilian woman defended the gentleman's right to be left alone." Sarah felt Marcus's eyes on her, and when she looked up, she saw something she'd rarely encountered: genuine admiration from someone who understood the courage it had taken for her to speak up. Captain Rodriguez approached Sarah directly. "Ma'am, I need to apologize on behalf of the department. You should never have been put in this position, and your willingness to stand up for what's right reflects the best of our community." "I just did what anyone should do," Sarah said quietly. "No," Marcus said firmly. "What you did was extraordinary. Most people would have stayed quiet to avoid trouble. You risked your own safety to defend a stranger." Captain Rodriguez turned to Bradley. "Officer, you're suspended pending a full internal investigation. Turn in your badge and weapon immediately." Bradley's face cycled through shock, anger, and, finally, desperate pleading. "Captain, you can't do this. It was just a misunderstanding. I was trying to keep the community safe. By lying about receiving complaints? By threatening innocent citizens? By ignoring evidence that contradicted your assumptions?" The captain's voice was sharp as steel. "These aren't the actions of an officer trying to keep anyone safe. These are the actions of someone who's forgotten what the badge represents." As Bradley reluctantly handed over his badge and gun, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions. She was relieved that justice was being served, but she also felt a little sorry for the man. Whatever had led him to this point, whether it was prejudice, anger, or just a bad day taken too far, his career was likely over. Captain Rodriguez addressed Marcus again. "Sir, you're free to go, and again I apologize for this incident. If you choose to file a formal complaint, the department will support whatever action you decide to take." Marcus looked thoughtful for a moment. "Captain, I appreciate your professionalism and the way you've handled this situation. I think justice has been served for today." After the officers left, taking a sullen Bradley with them, the diner fell, quiet except for the familiar buzz of fluorescent lights. Sarah and Marcus looked at each other across the counter, both processing what had just happened. "You realize you probably just made an enemy," Marcus said gently. Sarah nodded, the reality of potential consequences settling over her like a cold blanket. "I know, but I couldn't live with myself if I'd stayed silent." Marcus stood up and extended his hand to her. "Ma'am, It's been an honor meeting someone with real courage. I won't forget what you did today." As they shook hands, Sarah felt something shift inside her. For the first time in years, she felt proud of herself, not just as a mother or a hard worker, but as a person who'd stood up for what was right when it mattered most. The tension in the diner was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah's heart pounded so hard she was sure everyone could hear it, but she kept her chin up and her eyes locked on Officer Bradley. She'd crossed a line there was no going back from, and she knew it. "You're making a big mistake, lady," Bradley growled, his hand moving instinctively toward his baton. "This isn't some movie where you play the hero. This is real life, and real life has consequences." Sarah swallowed hard but didn't flinch. "The only mistake I see is 3 police officers harassing a paying customer who's done absolutely nothing wrong." Marcus slowly turned on his stool, his movements careful and deliberate. "Officers, I understand you're just doing your job, but this woman is telling the truth. I've been sitting right here for over an hour. She's got security cameras if you need proof." Officer Bradley's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "Security cameras can be tampered with. And since when do we take the word of criminals and their sympathizers? Criminal?" Sarah's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "What crime has he committed? Eating pie? Leaving a tip? Having a polite conversation?" The youngest of the 3 officers, who looked barely old enough to shave, cleared his throat nervously. Sergeant Bradley, maybe we should just check his ID and move on. We don't really have any evidence of wrongdoing." Bradley spun around to glare at the young officer. "Rookie, when I want your opinion, I'll ask for it. Until then, keep your mouth shut and learn how real police work gets done." The humiliation in the young officer's eyes reminded Sarah of her own son when he was being bullied at school. Authority didn't automatically make someone right, and power without compassion was just another form of bullying. "Real police work?" Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "Real police work is protecting and serving the community, not intimidating innocent people because you don't like the way they look." Marcus reached slowly for his wallet, keeping his movements visible. "Look, I'll show you my license, registration, insurance, whatever you need. I'm a veteran, served 2 tours in Afghanistan. I work construction when I'm not riding. I've got nothing to hide." He placed his military ID on the counter alongside his driver's license. The documentation showed Marcus Riley, age 54, clean record, honorable discharge from the Army Rangers. Even the rookie officer could see there was nothing suspicious about the man, but Bradley barely glanced at the identification. This wasn't about evidence or suspicious activity anymore. It was about pride and control. He'd been challenged in front of his subordinates by a waitress and a biker, and his ego wouldn't let him back down. "Fake IDs are easy to come by," he said dismissively. "I've seen plenty of bikers with fake military records trying to gain sympathy." That accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Sarah saw his hands clench briefly before he forced them to relax. Questioning a veteran's service was a line most people wouldn't cross, but Bradley seemed determined to escalate the situation no matter what. "That's enough," Sarah said firmly. "You've seen his identification. He's done nothing wrong. Either charge him with a specific crime or leave him alone." The 3rd officer, an older man with graying temples, finally spoke up. "Sarge, maybe we should call this in. Get some backup and do this by the book." Bradley's laugh was harsh and cold. "Backup? For 1 biker and a mouthy waitress? I think I can handle the situation just fine." He stepped closer to Sarah, using his size and authority to intimidate her. "You seem real concerned about your biker friend here. Makes me wonder what kind of relationship you 2 have. Maybe you're more involved in whatever he's planning than you're letting on." The implication was clear and disgusting. Sarah felt her face burn with anger and embarrassment, but she refused to be cowed by his crude insinuations. "That's completely inappropriate, and you know it," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "I defended him because it was the right thing to do, not because of any relationship beyond customer service." Marcus stood up slowly, his considerable height making him tower over the officer. "Now that's crossing a line, officer. This woman has been nothing but professional and decent. Don't you dare suggest otherwise. Sit down before I add threatening an officer to your charges. Bradley snapped, his hand moving to his weapon. What charges? Marcus asked, his voice dangerously quiet. You still haven't told me what I'm supposedly guilty of. Sarah realized the situation was spiraling out of control. Bradley was looking for any excuse to use force, and she could see the other officers becoming increasingly uncomfortable with their superior's behavior. The rookie kept glancing toward the door like he wanted to leave, while the older officer had his radio in his hand, clearly considering calling for backup whether Bradley wanted it or not. The diner's landline phone sat within arm's reach behind the counter. Sarah made a split-second decision that would change everything. While Bradley was focused on intimidating Marcus, she grabbed the phone and quickly dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher asked. This is Sarah Martinez at the Blue Moon Diner on Highway 47, she said quickly. I need to report. Police misconduct in progress. Officer Bradley, badge number 247, is harassing and threatening to arrest an innocent customer without cause. Bradley spun around, his face twisted with rage. Hang up that phone right now. The call's already placed, Sarah said, replacing the receiver. Now there's an official record. The older officer immediately got on his radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 12. We're going to need a supervisor at the Blue Moon Diner on Highway 47. We have a situation that needs immediate attention. Bradley looked like he might explode. What the hell do you think you're doing, Patterson? Following procedure. Sarge, this has gone way beyond a simple check and needs to be handled properly. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror. She'd just made enemies of at least one police officer, maybe more. But she couldn't have lived with herself if she'd stayed silent while Marcus was illegally harassed and arrested. Marcus looked at her, with profound respect and gratitude. Ma'am, I don't know many people who would have done what you just did. Someone had to, Sarah replied simply, though her hands were shaking as she poured herself a glass of water. Sarah Martinez wiped down the same counter for the third time that morning, her tired eyes scanning the empty diner. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the worn vinyl booths and cracked linoleum floor. At 32, she felt much older, the weight of raising two young children alone pressing down on her shoulders like a heavy blanket she couldn't shake off. The Blue Moon Diner had been her lifeline for the past 2 years, ever since her husband walked out, without a word, leaving behind only unpaid bills and broken promises. The job didn't pay much, but it was steady work, and her boss, Frank, had been understanding about her need to leave early for school pickups and sick days. The regulars were mostly truck drivers and construction workers who appreciated her quick service and genuine smile, even when she felt like falling apart inside. It was just after 2 in the afternoon when the door chimed, and Sarah looked up to see a man she'd never encountered before. He was tall and lean, wearing a black leather vest over a faded denim shirt. His arms were covered in tattoos, and his long gray hair was pulled back in a ponytail. Despite his intimidating appearance, his eyes were kind, and he moved with the careful grace of someone who understood that his presence might make others uncomfortable. Afternoon, ma'am, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle as he slid onto a stool at the counter. Could I trouble you for a cup of coffee and maybe a slice of that apple pie I saw in the case? Sarah nodded, grateful for the customer. Business had been slow all week, and every dollar mattered when you were counting pennies to make rent. She poured him a steaming cup of coffee and cut a generous slice of pie, noting how he thanked her politely and left a $1 tip even before finishing his order. You're new around here? She said, refilling his cup without being asked. Just passing through, he replied, taking a careful sip. Name's Marcus. I ride with a group and we're heading up to Sturgis for the rally. Heard you made the best pie in 3 counties. Sarah smiled genuinely for the first time that day. Well, I don't know about that, but my grandmother's recipe hasn't failed me yet. They chatted easily while he ate, and Sarah found herself relaxing. Marcus was polite and respectful, asking about her children when he noticed their crayon drawings taped to the wall behind the register. He didn't pry, but when she mentioned how hard it was being a single parent, he simply nodded with understanding. Takes a strong woman to do what you're doing, he said quietly. My sister raised 3 kids on her own after her husband died. Toughest person I've ever known. The peaceful afternoon was shattered when the door burst open with such force it rattled the windows. 3 police officers stormed in, hands resting on their weapons, their faces hard with suspicion and barely contained aggression. "Well, well, what do we have here?" Officer Bradley sneered, his eyes fixed on Marcus. Sarah knew Bradley by reputation. He was the kind of cop who saw enemies everywhere and treated every interaction like a potential fight. Marcus remained calm, his hands visible on the counter as he continued eating his pie. "Afternoon, officers. Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Don't get smart with me, biker," Bradley snapped, stepping closer. "We got reports of suspicious activity. Someone matching your description was seen casing houses in the neighborhood." Sarah frowned, glancing between Marcus and the officers. The accusation seemed ridiculous. Marcus had been sitting at her counter for over an hour, never once acting suspicious or making anyone uncomfortable. "There must be some mistake," Sarah said carefully. "This gentleman has been here the whole time, just having coffee and pie." Bradley's cold gaze shifted to her. "Ma'am, I'd suggest you stay out of police business. These motorcycle gang members are dangerous criminals. You don't know what you're dealing with." Marcus set down his fork slowly, his jaw tightening slightly. "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just a man having a meal before getting back on the road." "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Bradley ordered, already reaching for his handcuffs. "We're taking you in for questioning." "On what charges?" Marcus asked calmly, though Sarah could see the frustration building in his eyes. "Loitering, suspicious behavior, and whatever else I decide to add," Bradley replied with a cruel smile. Sarah felt something hot and angry rise in her chest. She'd watched this kind of harassment before, seen how some officers abused their power against people who looked different or didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable. Marcus had done absolutely nothing wrong. He'd been nothing but polite and respectful. "This is wrong," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "He's done nothing illegal. He's been a perfect customer, and you can't arrest someone for having tattoos and riding a motorcycle." Bradley whirled on her, his face flushing red. "Lady, I warned you to stay out of this. Keep running your mouth and you might find yourself in cuffs too." The threat hung in the air like smoke, but Sarah couldn't back down. Her children's faces flashed in her mind. What kind of world was she leaving them if good people stayed silent while others were treated unfairly? "I'm not afraid of you," she said, surprised by her own courage. "And I'm not going to stand here and watch you harass an innocent man. If you want to arrest him, you better have a real reason, not just prejudice and assumptions." The other 2 officers looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight and avoiding eye contact. Even they seemed to recognize that their colleague was overstepping bounds. Marcus looked at Sarah with something like amazement. "Ma'am, you don't have to do this. I can handle whatever comes." But Sarah had already made her choice. Sometimes in life, you reach a moment where you have to decide what kind of person you want to be. For Sarah Martinez, standing in her worn-down diner with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, that moment had arrived.